fact, in recognition of his work, Soumya has received numerous accolades, including the Danzig Dissertation Award, the MSOM Responsible Research Award, the Public Sector Operations Best Paper Award, and the Doing Good with Good OR Award. Today, he'll be presenting his work related to the context of improving artisanal supply chains in resource-constrained settings. The focus of his research is to address the challenges faced by these artisanal supply chains, which are crucial to the global rural economy, especially to provide employment opportunities to women in the developing world. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Soumya. Over to you, Soumya.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that kind introduction. Thank you also, Maya and Devjit, for inviting me here. It's my first time in Ahmedabad, and I'm looking forward to visiting again very soon, hopefully. Today, what I'll be doing is presenting my most recent work on a data-driven approach to improve artisans' productivity in distributed supply chains. This is joint work with Divya Singhvi, who is at NYU Stern, and our PhD student, Xinyu Zhang, who is also at NYU Stern. It's a work in progress, so I would welcome any comments, feedback, suggestions that you might have to further improve this paper before we submit it. Before I get into the details of the project, let me start by talking more broadly about artisanal supply chains and why there is value in focusing on this question. Artisanal supply chains play a very important role in economies of developing countries. They are the second largest employer of workforce after agriculture, and very importantly, they are one of the biggest employers for rural women, often because of societal pressures. Women are unable to work in many industries, but with artisanal supply chains, women are able to work through their own households, through their own courtyards. So this plays a very important role in many developing countries. From a financial standpoint, global artisanal market is expected to generate almost $984 billion per year in 2022 and 2023. But this doesn't mean that it doesn't suffer from challenges. A very key challenge that artisanal supply chains, especially in developing countries, face is that of very high fragmentation and very low productivity. So some estimates suggest that productivity of artisans in developing countries is still only half of that in more developed settings. And this is not a challenge that we have identified. This challenge has been identified by many startups, government organizations, policymakers, and there have been recent interventions by different startups, including Soko in Kenya, Mahila Print in India, as well as Anu, which are all trying to tackle these challenges in different ways. The idea is to see how we can bring digital interventions to ultimately improve productivity and improve welfare of smallholder artisans in these supply chains. And this is exactly where our collaborator comes into picture. This work is in collaboration with Jaipur Rugs, which is one of the largest exporters of handmade rugs from India. It employs almost 40,000 artisans across 6,000 looms across 5 states in India, predominantly in Rajasthan. And the founder, who is Nand Kishore Chaudhary, has also been referred to as India's rug saint because of his drive to bring social impact for these smallholder artisans. And this is also visible from the fact that the wages that Jaipur Rugs offers is often almost double of any other competitor in the market. So when we started working with them, our focus was to understand how we can improve productivity for these artisans. And well, if we have to improve productivity, we start by looking at whether this is even a challenge or not. And what we really find is that 60% of the looms have lower than expected productivity from their data set. And by lower than expected productivity, what I mean is they have some standards on how much work each artisan should be completing. 60% of the looms actually do not meet that threshold. Now, why should we care about it when we are worried about social impact? Because increase in productivity would directly translate to increase in income. And income for these low-income households, any increase in income for these low-income households can bring a significant change in their livelihoods. So the question we focus on throughout is how can we further increase the productivity and income of these rural artisans? And because I will be focusing on rug making throughout this talk, let me just start by describing to you what the rug making process looks like. So raw wool is first hemmed and it's converted into threads. Threads are then dyed and different colors are produced. After that, a design map is generated. This is the design map. And what happens is each artisan is expected to follow this design map when they are making a rug. Now, this task is very labor intensive, and on average, each rug takes around 69 days in our data set to complete. So more than 2 months on average for just one rug, completion of one rug. And this is the video that I'll play is, it's not sped up, and it's one artisan that we actually saw working on a rug during one of our field visits. So this is the speed at which they work. So you can imagine this requires a lot of effort from artisan side, and there are a lot of factors that actually affect their productivity. So quality being a key component, and by quality what I mean is each rug has some density, and this is the density of the knots that can be fit in, and the higher the density is, the more difficult or more intricate designs can be made, and as a result, longer that rug takes. So in addition to that, there are a lot of other factors that actually affect, how long it takes for a rug to be completed. After this rug is completed, next the rug is sent for further finishing. And once finishing happens, the rugs are sold through different channels, including, retail stores, as well as online websites, as well as exports directly to external markets, predominantly Europe and US. Now, this is what the supply chain looks like. And in order to better understand it, what we did was a series of field visits. Our objective was to talk with different stakeholders. So the key stakeholders in the supply chain obviously are the weavers who are weaving. Very importantly, branch managers. So the whole geographical area in which Jaipurux operates is divided into different branches. Each branch has a single branch manager under whom there are multiple supervisors. So what you see in this image is a supervisor, and each supervisor is assigned a set of villages who he visits regularly. So each supervisor will have multiple villages, and each village will have multiple weavers who he will visit. Remember, these are not factory type setups. So you really have to visit these weavers, these women artisans, if you have to interact with them, if you have to assign them any new task and so on. So few key insights came out from these field interactions. First was in contrast to what we thought, which is, artisans might be working only for a few hours in a day, and this might only be a source of supplementary income. Actually, this is the primary source of income for most of the artisans, women artisans in the supply chain. They work from 9 to 6, and the income they have generated has actually been transformative. Many of them have been able to build their pakka homes just because of the income that weaving brings to the family. Second is, these are very geographically isolated regions, and because these are geographically isolated regions, weavers have to rely on Jaipurux for all the tasks except the actual act of weaving. So I described various steps in the supply chain. Everything is handled by Jaipurux except the actual act of weaving. So really they rely on Jaipurux to finish, bring the raw produce, figure out what is the design to assign, and finally sell the finished product. Weavers are basically paid based on the amount of work they finish in any given month. Yes.
This segment which we see, so is that also the responsibility of Jaipurux, the weaving setup?
Yes, exactly. So each courtyard will have a loom like this, and the loom is set up by Jaipurux.
There is a breakdown, I'm saying, in the factory sense, but I don't know how often it is. But if there is anything like that, it's the responsibility of Jaipurux.
Exactly. So if there is a breakdown, we do not have access to that data set. But from our interactions, it doesn't happen very often, especially in the initial years. If there is a breakdown, though, Jaipurux will bring someone to take care of it. Yes. And the last thing is supervisors. So because these are geographically isolated regions, supervisor interactions play a very critical role. So supervisors are visiting weavers regularly, and they are the only node from the company's side that interact with weavers on a regular basis. And these interactions, at least qualitatively, what we identified was play a key role when it comes to thinking about productivity improvements. And I'll talk in more detail about why this is the case, what are the mechanisms through which we think supervisor interactions can ultimately affect weavers' productivity in this supply chain. So to summarize, we started with the question of how to improve productivity. Based on our field visits, where we ended was, well, if we have to improve productivity, we really have to think about what is the impact of supervisor visits on productivity. And indeed, if we find a significant impact from supervisor visits, the next question is, can we optimize supervisor operations to ultimately further improve productivity in this supply chain and generate practical implementable solutions for Jaipuraks? I keep referring to Jaipuraks here, but let me clarify that many of the supply chains in this industry have a very similar setup, where just by the nature of the production, many of the players have to take care of all the tasks that I just described, except the actual act of weaving. So the solutions that we are building here can actually be implemented by other players who are working with geographically isolated artisans. And please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, because this is a new context. I completely understand if you have questions about the context or the data. The caste composition, often it's the interactions that we had were mostly from scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Sorry. So I'm not very well aware of exactly what castes, but at least what we were told is it's often from SC/ST castes. Yes.
The video that you were showing, she was already working at superhuman speed. So
I'll clarify how we measure artisans' productivity. You are right. If you're already working at that speed, the first question is how can you even further improve it? But what I will try to show you in the coming slides is what are different factors that can slow this artisan down. And really what we are trying to do is how can we make sure that these issues do not arise? We preempt them. Yeah. And one example just to quickly tell you is, by mistake, if you use a wrong color, or if you have slanted weaving, that's just an error, inadvertent error, but that is actually going to slow you down if I catch you, later, because you have to reweave. Yeah. So our visits were close to Jaipur. They have a cluster close to Jaipur. They also have a cluster further south close to Ajmer. They are also working with some artisans in Gujarat, as well as some artisans in Uttar Pradesh.
So basically, Jaipur is basically working under nearby Gujarat and Udaipur area, right?
So
Southern Rajasthan.
Jaipur is north.
It's in eastern. Jaipur is in east.
Well, depends on your point of context, but yeah, sure.
So basically, I just want to know, because the tribal and scheduled caste in the Rajasthan, they are the different practices. Like it's like the data which you have to the work which you have taken out, it's on the weavers only. Basically, it's Jaipur is working on the weavers, right? The clothes industry and all.
Yeah. So I'm not going to make any claims about. That's an interesting and important problem to think about, but I'm not going to make any claims related to socio-economic features of these artisans.
Mm-hmm.
What I'll talk about here is the productivity of artisans and how it relates to supply chain features, not other features, because we don't have access to that data yet. Yes.
Why would you choose supervisors within the factor of productivity?
Very good point. There are many other ways in which you could actually think about improving productivity. Some other areas that we are working on currently are improving the matching itself. So a key question that plays out in the supply chain is which weaver should be assigned what rug. And you can think about improving that assignment itself. That would just mean more changes in the supply chain, and it's a problem that will require longer term effort. So we are continuing with that, but we believe that this is also an important aspect that can ultimately improve productivity in these supply chains. The reason we focus on it is it can actually play out in many other settings where you have this geographically distributed structure of production. And we think that the solutions that we develop here can directly apply to such settings as well.
Are you going to progress this question further? Or?
These two, this is the key contributions from our work.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Is that you're suggesting supervisors visiting the artisans or their workshops will improve their productivity to some reason or the other. So it seems to me very similar to the Hawthorne effect, right? So if someone is being observed, they tend to do better. And that's what Hawthorne effect is all about, which is what we also correct in field studies and RCTs. So how is it any different from that? So if you have the feeling of simply installing a camera or someone watching over me, you'll tend to do better. Perform better. And then this effect slows down after 4 or 5 months when you're comfortable with the person watching. So that's quite widely studied. Why would you expect any different?
So, well, in our case, supervisors' interactions are, there are two opposing factors, right? On one side, and actually I'll talk about this maybe in 2 slides. Let's wait for that slide to appear, and then maybe hopefully if it's not clear, then we can bring it up again. Yeah. So through this work, we make the following key contributions. The first one is using rigorous empirical impact assessment. We are able to show that more frequent supervisor visits actually can have a very significant impact on productivity, almost 3 to 14% improvement in productivity, as well as income. And importantly, this effect is heterogeneous in nature. We find that visits to rugs that are more difficult to weave are actually more beneficial. And again, based on these insights, what we do is think about answering the next question, which is, if there is heterogeneous impact, what can we do about it on the ground? Are there solutions that can be implemented to exploit this fact, which motivates us to think about optimizing the supervisor routing? And this is what we focus on next. So the idea here is to think about how we can target looms or artisans who have lower productivity and make sure that supervisor interactions with those looms are more frequent. So this involves 2 steps, basically a predict then optimize approach, where we use machine learning models to predict which looms are likely to have lower productivity. And based on those predictions, and mixed integer linear program and a team orienteering based reformulation to basically see how this problem of optimizing supervisor visits can be solved in a tractable manner. Finally, we have designed a field implementation, and actually it's in progress now, where we are trying to see what is the impact from this solution on the ground by implementing it for a set of weavers in the supply chain. So I'll not get into the details of the literature review, and I have focused here only on papers that are most relevant from OM field. But let me just highlight that ours is the first work that looks at this problem for distributed supply chains where production is happening at an individual level from individual households. And we are able to show rigorously that there is indeed a significant impact. And basically, based on this impact, you can develop implementable solutions that can hopefully potentially drive impact in practice. So let me start by talking more about impact of visits on weaving times and hopefully answer your question about why we should even think about answering this question. So because we will be focusing on this question throughout, let me just describe supervisor-weaver interactions in more detail. So let's say there is a supervisor who is based here in Sujapur, and he has been assigned a set of villages. What will the supervisor do? Well, supervisor can decide their own schedules currently, and what they might do is visit, these 2 villages on one side. Each visit to a village would mean visit to every weaver in that village. And once those visits are complete, he might decide to visit the other 2 villages on the next day. Now, what does every visit entail? There are a set of expectations that supervisors are meant to meet. The first one is to motivate the weavers to complete tasks on time. That's one. The second very important one is to make sure that there are no errors. So if there are any inadvertent errors, then supervisors often are very good at identifying these errors, and the rectification actually takes time. So if the errors are identified more quickly, really what would happen is the reweaving costs are actually going to be lower, which would eventually mean that you have better productivity. More work can be completed in the same amount of time. And sorry. Each supervisor is an employer of Jaipur Rugs, so they're paid a fixed income and they are assigned a set of villages and they're expected to manage these villages. And the goal is to track progress, motivate weavers and supervise quality, as I mentioned. Now, the question is, why do we think this is an important question to think about? Well, on one end, we expect that these weavers might be able to learn more effective task completion strategies by visits. On the other hand, there is also literature which suggests that excessive interventions or involvement from supervisors can actually harm productivity because it might lead to more anxiety. Weavers might themselves not focus on tasks that are most important, but might actually focus more on just preparing as soon as they know that the supervisors might be visiting. So based on the extant literature, increased supervision can either help or actually lower productivity. This question has not been analyzed in the setting of distributed supply chains. So that's why we think that the first contribution that this work makes is to look at this data from a distributed supply chain perspective and see whether increased supervisor visits or increased supervision can ultimately improve productivity or not. So the first question we ask is, what is the impact of visits on weaving times?
Just going back to my earlier question, these 2 points I don't know what your study duration was. So what was it? How long did you study these weavers?
So we have data from around 5 years.
5 years. Oh, then I think that'll be corrected. Because what happens is, even when there is anxiety, you can't tell because the performance would still improve. And that is what supervision does. So which is what Hawthorne effect is all about, right? So when you're observing people, they feel stressed that they're being observed, so they improve their performance. And you feel that this group, the treatment group, is doing better than the control, but the only reason is the researcher is observing them. So they feel they should perform better. So, but the good thing is that this effect dissipates over time usually. And so if you've been studying them over 5 years, then perhaps that's already taken care of.
So that's a great point. Another point that I'll make here is the mechanism that we think drives the result is also unique to the distributed structure of the supply chain. So the fact that you have these inadvertent errors, and these inadvertent errors often are observed by the supervisors who are visiting. That's a key channel through which we think we observe some of these results. And that potentially would not be a mechanism that affects standard factory settings. Yeah.
Also, it's not just when the supervisor is observing what work is done, it's also all the past work that has been done when the supervisor wasn't there. So the errors could have occurred when it wasn't there.
Right.
It's not just the productivity during the observation. So
Perhaps
that.
Okay.
Oh yeah, let me clarify that there is no camera as such that can see in real time what the productivity is like. Here, what we really have is a supervisor who is going to a village and just looking at, oh, last time I visited, this is the amount of work that was done. Today, this is the amount of work that has been done. So this is the total amount of additional work that was done. And really, oh, are these errors appearing in the rug that was completed? If yes, I need to tell the weaver to rectify them, which will take additional time to complete, basically. Okay, so in terms of data, what we have is rug completion data from our collaborators. So this includes date on which the task was assigned, the total amount of time that the weaver took to complete this particular rug, the branch in which this task was assigned, the supervisor who was supervising, the loom ID, the exact loom on which this task was assigned, the exact design map. So for the rug that was completed, weaving density, as I mentioned, number of colors, again, because number of colors is probably going to affect, how long a rug takes to complete, as well as the loom size. So this is about 8,000 rugs across 920 looms in 5 Rajasthan branches. We also have exact dates of supervisor visits. Now, this is going to play a key role because this is effectively what will help us in figuring out whether more frequent supervisor visits ultimately benefit weavers or not. We collect Google Maps API data, which is pairwise distances between each supervisor location and loom location. Finally, we also collect temperature data because these artisans are working in open courtyards, and temperature might itself affect productivity based on extant literature. So let me just quickly show you some summary stats. On average, it takes 69 days for rug to be completed. Again, significant variation here. And what we are most interested in is this variable, which is average days between visits. Remember, the smaller this number is, the more frequent the visits are. There is more frequent supervision going on. And the larger this number is, less frequent is the supervision that's going on. So really what we are interested in is finding whether there is an effect from decreasing average days between visits on weaving times or not. So we unfortunately don't have data about exact duration or exactly what they did during those visits. That would be ideal. Actually, our collaborator has an app, but unfortunately, it's not used in the manner in which you would expect it to be used. So we don't have that granular data right now. So let me just show you some preliminary evidence. What you see here is in red is the bar, which is all the rugs for which average number of days between visits was larger than the median. So these are rugs that were visited less frequently. And in green is the set of rugs that were visited more frequently. What we see is a 7% difference in weaving times, and this difference is statistically significant. Obviously, there is a lot of other factors that might have affected completion time. So that is why what we do next is use a fixed effect specification. Yes.
Sorry, I think we already mentioned. Do you also have the information on the supervisor experience?
So we currently, supervisor experience in a way can be calculated in our data set by looking at how many rugs they have completed or how much cubage they have weaved so far, and that is what we use as a proxy. We are also in the process of collecting data to think about whether before they got associated with Jaipur rugs, if they were working with someone else, that might have increased their productivity or not.
Supervision.
Yes. In terms of our interactions, we think that most of these weavers have predominantly worked with Jaipur rugs, but again, that's something we are trying to collect from the field. Right?
And how many supervisors we're talking about roughly?
So the number of supervisors here are around 30.
30.
Yeah, around 30. Yeah.
So
Yes.
supervisors coming from their weavers community, or they are coming from different sectors of from various locations?
So social interactions here matter a lot, and most of the supervisors are from nearby. So because each supervisor will manage, around 1 to 15 villages, they usually will come from one of these villages or from, some location which is around these villages. Never from, let's say, Gujarat, somebody being sent from Gujarat to supervise weavers in Rajasthan. That doesn't happen.
So do they know how to weave, or they have certain other skills?
Yeah, many of them have actually had past experience in weaving, or they've been doing this job for a long time. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, there are a few questions. What is the minimum product cubage?
Product cubage is basically the total size of the rug that was completed, that is to be completed.
Okay, so there is another question. Did you have access to how the supervisors have been trained, and are all the supervisors men?
Very good question. So yes, I think except one supervisor in the data set, all of them are men. The question could be why is it the case, and you have women weavers, and why do we have men supervisors? The reason is because if you remember, I said supervisors have to travel around. They are assigned multiple villages. Again, it will be relatively more difficult for women to travel around, especially in rural areas. So what Jaipur Rugs has is mostly men as supervisors. The one woman who is a supervisor is basically assigned, I think, only one village. So she can easily just visit that village. That is one. You had another question, or that was it?
Did you have access to how the supervisors have been trained? So I guess.
Oh yeah. So the training is very consistent and uniform once they are part of the Jaipur Rugs network. They go through the same process. It takes around 6 months for each supervisor to be ready to go out in the field. Before being part of the Jaipur Rugs network, no. But what we know is for sure after Jaipur Rugs, they've been consistently trained. Anyways, in our empirical specifications, we will try to take differences between supervisors into account when we are thinking about this effect. Yes. That's a good point. In our data set, we rarely see weavers leaving. But I mean, in terms of attrition rates, you can have differences between different seasons.
Yeah.
So sometimes during, harvesting season, you can obviously have differences in who's available versus who's not. But in the long term, we do not see a lot of weavers leaving Jaipur Rugs supply chain itself. So most of the times, the weavers that have joined, they often remain in the system.
So basically, most of the weavers are women, right? And so I just feel like if supervisor is man, like sometimes they don't they don't know the problems of women. So maybe the attrition rate might be high. I just felt like.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very valid point. There is some research which actually talks about this effect itself, men versus women as supervisors for women. And you might see greater improvements if there were women supervisors. It's just more difficult in the current setup to have that intervention in place. But yeah, fair point.
So if there is a particular artisan who's making more mistakes, is it likely that the supervisor would visit that artisan more and more frequently? So, is it the case that someone who's making more errors is where you would see that the frequency of supervisor visits is higher? Or more broadly, how is the supervisor deciding how frequently to visit an artisan?
So actually, often what happens is, and I'll talk about this. This is one of the IVs that we use as well. Supervisors are broadly given directions on, you need to visit each weaver X number of times. And after that, supervisors are free to decide how to figure out their schedules. Now, if I were a supervisor, what would I do in this scenario? I would visit artisans who are closer to me more frequently because that's just easier.
Or I might go to the artisan who's making more mistakes so that I ensure that I get good qualities.
I mean, I'm not incentivized for getting good qualities, right? So
okay.
I am incentivized just to make sure that I meet my whatever
visit
broadly targets on aggregate level I meet or not of visits. So for me, what I would try is just visit artisans who are closer to me more frequently versus those who are farther away.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's actually the IV that we use and also find that it's strong and significant. Yeah. So let me just talk about the fixed effect specification now. Our key dependent variable is log transformed weaving time in days. So this is for each rug R assigned to loom L, supervised by supervisor S at time T. Our variable of interest is average number of days between supervisor visits. Again, what we think is if average number of days between supervisor visits increases, the weaving time goes up. So if beta 1 is positive and statistically significant, this would imply that indeed supervision helps. We also have a set of time variant and time invariant controls that are likely to affect weaving time. Some of these are not confounders, but will still affect weaving time. So they ultimately improve the efficiency of this specification. This includes, total number of colors in the rug, weaving density in the rug, product cubage of the rug, total experience of the weaver measured using total cubage so far weaved, cumulative cubage so far weaved on the loom, as well as average temperature. We also have fixed effects for loom, supervisor, harvesting season, and year. Loom and supervisor fixed effects take into account differences between supervision and between weaving that might occur across different supervisors and weavers. And harvesting season and year fixed effects account for differences in expenditure and income that might affect weaving rates across different years and harvesting seasons respectively. And finally, we cluster standard errors at loom level because observations from the same loom are likely to be correlated in our data set.
Here's a question. So Can you highlight a bit on how the remuneration to viewers are done? Is it done on a profit sharing basis or a fixed basis? And what would be the impact of that remuneration on viewing time?
No, that's a great point. Currently, what is done is the weavers are paid based on the amount of work they complete. It's a fixed rate. So if you are able to finish more, then you get paid more. This is basically per month basis. So every month, at the end of the month, the supervisor will note down how much work was completed. And then obviously, because weaving density plays a role, there is different rate for different weaving densities. The more intricate patterns will get you a higher rate, but the rates are normalized such that because higher weaving density will also take longer, on average, you will end up making the same amount of money. In terms of how it might impact, that's again a very good question. It's very likely that incentive schemes and contracts will ultimately affect weaving times. And there is a lot of scope in figuring out how that can be done more effectively in the supply chain. But because this is the current setup, at least in our results, we don't think this will affect things because for all weavers, the same sort of incentive mechanism is being used. So now, despite this, did you have a question? So temperature, we also had data on precipitation and temperature. I think we got consistent results. So we just included temperature, but with temperature and precipitation, we got similar results. Yeah. Okay, so despite this extensive set of controls, we still have challenges to identification. The first challenge is reverse causality. As you mentioned, one challenge is it might be the case that, if you observe longer weaving times, you just have more frequent visits, which would basically mean that the average days between visits now is smaller. So clearly this is a concern. And one thing we do is instrumental variables. The other thing that we do is basically filter our data. So we do an additional robustness check where we only use data when none of the rugs were actually delayed. So there is an expected time of completion, and this effect is going to be most salient after the rugs have been delayed. So what we can do is just look at data of visits before any of the rugs were delayed and see whether we still see consistent results. Again, this is a robustness check in addition to the instrumental variables, which we think already accounts for this challenge. The second is unobserved confounders. Again, there might be a lot of unobserved confounders that might affect our results. One is shocks in household expenditure of weavers. If you expect that there is going to be a marriage, in family, maybe you want more income to be generated, and that basically motivates you to work harder, which increases your weaving speed, ultimately decreases the total weaving time. Because supervisors come from the same community, they might actually be aware of this fact. And if they're aware of this fact, they might decrease the effort they put in order to supervise you, because they already know that weaving times are going to be shorter, given the increased need of income. So again, we tackle these challenges using the instrumental variables approach. And for an instrument to be valid, we want two conditions to be satisfied: relevance and exclusion. Relevance is basically first stage, which says, the instrument that you're identifying is actually affecting your variable of interest. And exclusion is basically that instrument should be uncorrelated with the error term. And we identified two such IVs. The first one is distance between loom and supervisor home locations. Now it's likely to be relevant because, as I mentioned earlier, we expect because supervisors are deciding their own routes, it's likely that supervisors are going to visit looms that are closer to them more frequently than looms that are farther away. And it's likely to satisfy the exclusion condition because distance should not directly affect weaving times in our setup. The second instrumental variable that we use is that of average days between visits for the previous round. Again, this is likely to be relevant because there is going to be some sort of consistency in which loom supervisors visit how frequently. And it's likely to satisfy the exclusion condition because previous rugs inter-arrival times should not directly be correlated with the current rug's focal term, especially because each rug takes around more than 2 months to complete. Now, both of these IVs first stages are significant and these IVs are not weak. And let me now show you the results from the estimation. What I want you to focus on is this first row. And from all the three specifications, what we find is statistically significant and positive impact. So as the average days between visits goes up, the amount of time it takes to complete that rug also increases. This difference is this impact is very significant. Yes.
So when you say that, you're identifying this by location of the weaver, right? And I'm assuming the supervisor, irrespective of who the supervisor is, the supervisor's location does not change, which means that this particular artisan has been historically visited many times because the supervisor has always been at that location. And then I'm guessing because of frequent visits from the supervisor, this artisan is becoming more and more of an expert because you're getting constant feedback, right? So your skill and your performance would continue improving, right? So don't you think that would kind of affect, I mean, it's going to affect the performance of the artisan because with frequent visits, I'm getting better and better.
So the kind of errors that we are talking about are more inadvertent. So, the fact that you have wrong color often it's consistently across. I mean, there might be some role of experience, but it occurs even with less experienced and more experienced weavers. Just because you get very different colors for each rug and so on.
No, but if it is indeed inadvertent and unrelated to a supervisor's visit, then why do you think there should be any causality between the two? Any causal relationship between the two?
Supervisor visits definitely help in identifying those errors. So if an error occurs inadvertently, the visits definitely help with identification of those errors.
So yeah, so won't I get better and better with identification if there are more supervisor visits that have happened at my location, which is likely going to be the case because the supervisor's location never changes, right?
Probably you would get better and better, yeah.
So then I'm less likely to make mistakes anyway. I'm getting better.
So let me just clarify. We have loom level fixed effects. And because we have loom level fixed effects, we are really identifying within that loom what is the effect. And despite the fact that you might be consistently visiting a particular loom more, there is still variation in how often you visit. So effectively what we are doing here is exploiting this within loom variation in visits by the supervisors to identify our effect.
So the location is not uncorrelated with performance. That's what I'm saying, right? With productivity. So then, would this be the best IV? Because it is kind of related. It would be related to performance because if I'm located close to the supervisor, I'm likely to be better at identifying defects. So then, my performance or my productivity would be better. So then, it wouldn't possibly be the best IV.
Okay, I think let's, in the interest of time, let me just discuss this more offline. But I think given the two IVs, the results should still hold, but I'm happy to discuss this more offline. Yeah. So what we find is statistically significant and positive effect. And one thing that I will highlight is that in terms of income as well, this is significant, almost 15% increase in monthly income, just by 1 day decrease in average days between visits. And these results continue to hold consistently under a series of robustness checks, importantly also using an entirely new data set, which is basically payments made to the weavers. Again, this is a data set for a much shorter time span, so we don't use this throughout in our analysis, but we find consistent results for all of these specifications. Now, the next question is, why do we see positive effects from supervisor visits? And our hypothesis is that inadvertent errors, as I've been mentioning, or weaving difficulty plays a key role. So if supervisor help in identifying errors, most commonly, wrong colors, slanted weaving, and so on, then really what will happen is if these errors are identified quickly, then the amount of reweaving that needs to be done will be smaller. So in this example, if you have more frequent visits, let's say a weaver started doing slanted weaving, then what will happen is, because of more frequent visits, the amount of rework that needs to be done will be just smaller. In contrast, if you have less frequent visits, the amount of rework that needs to be done is more. Because this happens, really what will happen is longer weaving time. So you would want to identify errors more quickly in this setup, and these errors are more likely to appear in rugs that are more difficult to weave. So what we do is again test for heterogeneous treatment effects, basically by interacting our variable of interest with an indicator variable, which is 1, when rugs have higher weaving density or more colors. And what we find is that again there is a significant additional impact from reducing average days between visits for these rugs which have higher weaving density or more colors, suggesting that identifying errors may be one of the mechanisms through which supervisor visits help in improving productivity for our artisans. So given this analysis so far, let me now hopefully for the rest of the talk focus on how we can use these insights to optimize supervisor operations to ultimately improve productivity. So what we have seen so far is there is heterogeneity in impact. So there are some rugs that will benefit more versus others from the supervision. And what we want to do next is think about how we can use this insight to identify new supervisor routes. That is what we'll do next. So, well, in an ideal world, what we could have done is just increase supervisor visits to all the looms, to all the villages, because that would have ultimately improved productivity everywhere, but that's not practical. Obviously, we can't increase visits to every loom because there are operational constraints in how much supervisors can work on any given day. So really then what we need to do is think about doing this in a smarter fashion, identifying rugs which are going to benefit the most from these supervisor visits. Yes. There is only one woman supervisor. So yeah.
Because when rain days kind of stuff is affect the supervisor visiting, it doesn't have any transportation.
Yeah, so they usually use either the two-wheelers, motorbikes, or public transport to make the visits.
But if I did two-wheeler in one day, the village is around.
So for most of them, the maximum distance is not more than 55-60 kilometers. So really they are able to, and this is the maximum distance I'm talking about. So they are able to use public transport or their bikes to complete the visits. So we have seasonal fixed effects that should account for the quality of the transportation itself. But I think they are able to, in most cases, they are actually indeed able to more or less meet the target, if you mean what, yeah. So the second option then is to think about what we could do. So if in an ideal world, we knew which looms are likely to have low productivity and which ones are likely to have high productivity, well, we could then just target those low productivity looms. Clearly, we don't have that data. We don't know in future which looms are likely to have lower productivity. So what we can do is make a prediction task out of it. We can use our data to predict which looms are likely to have lower than expected productivity. And we do this and use benchmark state-of-the-art ML models. And what we find is very good accuracy. And what this suggests is really a method through which we can identify which looms can be targeted when we are thinking about optimizing supervisor visits. The next question is, once you have identified these two classes, how do you think about improving supervisor visits? One idea could be to make it completely flexible and directly optimize the number of visits you would make for each loom. That is very difficult to implement in practice because supervisors would not be able to think of a schedule where you're visiting one loom 10 times, another loom 2 times, and so on. So in order to simplify actual application of this tool, of this method, what we do is the following. So for all villages in which there is any loom which has lower productivity, we just increase the number of visits by 1. So instead of visiting twice in 2 weeks, you would visit this loom 3 times in 2 weeks. And all looms or all villages in which all the looms have, higher than expected productivity, you just do whatever you're doing, the status quo, which is just visit once every week. The next question is, how do we design these supervisor routes, supervisor schedules? So what we do is formulate a mixed integer linear program where our objective is to minimize the difference between this target visits that I just mentioned and actual visits that supervisors can make for each of these looms. And we have a series of operational constraints that we need to worry about. The first set of constraints are basically saying that you should not visit any loom less than C lower bar number of times or more than C upper bar number of times. The second set of the second constraint is basically related to traveling and actually supervising. So on average, every visit takes around 15 to 20 minutes to complete, and there is also travel distance that we need to worry about. So really, what this constraint is saying is you should not, the total amount of time that visits take by the supervisor should not be more than 5 to 6 hours. So this includes the supervision as well as distance travel time. And the next set of constraints are basically valid tool constraints. So these are our decision variables. And because we are identifying exact routes, what this says is you will visit a village only if there is at least one of these variables, which is 1. So if you have moved from I to J, and at least one of these XIJTs should be 1 for you to have visited village J. Otherwise, you have really not visited any village. The next constraint is no subtool constraint, again, which is standard in routing algorithms. Finally, we connect our variables with the objective function. And this optimization problem can be solved for problem instances in our setting because really, we have a few villages for each supervisor to worry about. But if you think about it, there are exponential number of constraints in terms of the number of village nodes there are in this problem. So we have to think about approximation polynomial time algorithms that can solve these problems, especially for larger instances, more quickly, more efficiently. And this is what we do next. So our problem is optimizing supervisor visit problem, which I just mentioned. What we try to do is draw an equivalence between this problem and team orienteering problem. Now, team orienteering problem is the celebrated variant of profit collecting TSP problem, where what you have is multiple vehicles. For each vehicle, you really need to identify a route. And for each node in the network, you are given some profits. So team orienteering problem identifies routes for these vehicles such that you maximize the aggregate profit that you can generate by visiting these villages or nodes in the network. Now, in terms of our problem and team orienteering problem, there are 2 key differences. The first is time horizon. For team orienteering problem, there is no time horizon. Really, you have multiple vehicles, but you don't have multiple days. This problem can be easily tackled by just thinking about days as vehicles in our setup. And the second problem is profits. We don't have profits, as I mentioned. What we really have is targets for each village. So how do we convert those targets into profits for each village? We can define a non-decreasing submodular profit function. And based on these 2 transformations, what we can show is an equivalence between our optimizing supervisor visit problem and team orienteering problem. Now, once we have shown this equivalence, what you can then do is use some of the existing polynomial time algorithms with provable guarantees to solve our problem as well. And that is what we do. Now, let me just show you some results from simulations. So given this end-to-end setup of predicting and then optimizing, do we actually find any impact gains or not, at least in our data set? So the setup that we'll use is data from 2017 to 2021 to create machine learning based prediction models. And basically, we will use rugs in the last 3 months to test. They will be our test set. And the setup that we'll follow is as follows. So for any active rug in the test set, we'll predict whether it has lower productivity or not, again, based on our machine learning models. So now we have a prediction for whether this rug is likely to have lower productivity or not for, and we also know which supervisors network this particular loom is part of. Based on that, we can decide how many visits we would ideally want. So again, if it's lower productivity, we want 3 visits per 2 weeks. If it's higher productivity, we want 1 week per 2 weeks, 1 visit per week. Once we have decided the number of visits, then we need to decide the supervisor routes. So this is exactly the optimization problem that I mentioned. Even if you have target visits, you really have to think about which village supervisors should visit when. So that will be done by our OSVP problem. And then finally, we recommend the supervisor routes. And we do this problem every week. We compare 3 different policies, machine learning predict then optimize, naive predict then optimize, and baseline policy. So what is baseline? What is machine learning predict then optimize? The prediction is also machine learning based, and the optimization is also OSVP based. So yes. So for the prediction, what we are doing is using XGBoost and classifiers as well as random forests, and then basically picking the best model. Yeah.
When you do it, so has already, let us say, 100 visits, then how, so they would have been a visit or they wouldn't have been a visit. So how do you account for that?
So we update all the features that can be updated based on what happened in the previous week, and then make a prediction again to see what might have happened.
Which means, if I understand right, the prediction has another or more variables.
Yes. The prediction model has more variables. It's using more setup, more features. Yeah. The next policy is a naive predict then optimize, which is basically naive prediction. Maybe you can't use ML based models. So what if you just naively predicted that previous week's weaving rate will continue to exist for this current week as well, and you also had an optimization model. So based on this prediction, you would still use our optimization model to identify routes. And finally, baseline policy is what Jaipurx is currently doing, where it is neither optimizing nor making predictions for what might happen in the next week. And let's see what the results look like. So you see 2 clusters here. The first cluster is visits on lower than expected productivity rugs. The second cluster is visits on higher than expected productivity rugs. So what is the first thing we would want? We would want more visits on lower than expected productivity rugs. What we see is indeed both machine learning predict then optimize and naive predict then optimize are able to do that, in contrast to the baseline policy. So really what Jaipurx currently does is supervisors focusing more on rugs that are actually higher than expected productivity anyways. So both MPTO and NPTO can directly bring in benefits by increasing effort from supervisors on rugs that are likely to have lower than expected productivity. The second key insight is that actually, even compared to naive predict then optimize, machine learning predict then optimize is more efficient at targeting rugs that have lower than expected productivity. And you can see that from the fact that the visits on lower than expected productivity are even more for looms which are lower than expected productivity for MPTO. So overall, what this suggests is that indeed significant effect from this predict then optimize approach, despite the fact that this approach is accounting for many of the operational constraints, that significantly brings down some of the benefits that increased visits could have on weaving rates and weaving times. And based on these insights, what we have now done is we are implementing this whole approach in the field, where we have identified a set of supervisors for which we will implement this predict then optimize approach and decide their supervisor routes, and we'll compare them to a benchmark case where the routes are not optimized. And our hope is to see whether we see any positive effect on the ground or not. This has also meant that we need to better monitor supervisor routes and see what they are doing or not, which has included designing additional software tools for our collaborator. And we are hoping that we'll see positive results, which will allow us to expand this implementation to other looms and other branches in the coming months. So let me just summarize our contributions from this work. First, we are able to show a significant impact from increased visits on productivity for distributed supply chains. This effect is heterogeneous in nature, and I would like to highlight that the distributed structure is not unique to our collaborator supply chain, but it is prevalent in many other artisanal supply chains, as well as other supply chains that are common in developing countries. And we think that some of the insights from this work can actually apply there with minor tweaks. Second is using the insights, we develop a tool which uses optimization and ML-based methodologies to ultimately develop an implementable solution that can target weavers or looms that would benefit the most from increased supervision. And we use team orienteering based problem to actually scale this optimization problem and solve it efficiently. And finally, we are hoping that the results from the field trial are going to show actual impact from this methodology on the ground and allow us to expand the implementation to a larger set of branches and hopefully other collaborators in this field. Thank you.